France is on fire, not metaphorically, I mean literally, if you consider the geopolitical fires raging across the Sahel. In 2024, the military rulers of Niger tore up a uranium contract that had fed France's nuclear reactors for half a century. Think about that for a second. Half a century. Overnight, Paris lost the cheapest, most reliable fuel on its books. Orano's supply chain, a bedrock of French energy security, simply collapsed. And what followed wasn't just a ripple, it was a full-blown stampede, a wave of unrest that spread not just across France but also Europe. One single decision made by the military leader of Niger didn't just unplug 15% of the uranium that keeps France's lights on. It may have unplugged the very last crumbling pillar of France's African empire. It's a seismic shift, but how on earth did one of the poorest countries on the planet bring a nuclear giant like France to its knees? And why, if you look at the headlines, are Russian and Chinese flags now waving over the mines that once bled exclusively for Paris? And about how deeply wired France's economy was into a system that was always going to unravel. Stay with us as we unravel this story. France, my friends, never really left Africa after 1960. Oh, the flags of independence went up, sure, and the speeches were made. But behind the scenes, something far more insidious was being built. It was called Françafrique, a shadowy backstage web of currency boards, military pacts, and sweetheart resource deals that let Paris call the shots long after the colonial administrators had supposedly packed their bags. This wasn't some accidental oversight. It was a meticulously designed system, created to ensure France's continued access to vital resources and economic leverage, even as the world spoke of decolonization. When the media isn't asking the hard questions, and when the beneficiaries are happy to keep the secret. And in this crown jewel of an empire, Niger's uranium was the undisputed king. In 1967, French engineers, representing the state-owned Atomic Energy Commission, carved open the open-pit mine at Arlit. And what did they do? They signed a 50-year accord that locked the price at a joke and the royalties at pocket change. Let me say that again, a joke. We're talking about a deal so lopsided, so utterly skewed in France's favor, it's almost unbelievable. The calculus was brutal, but brutally effective for France. France got the fuel that powers 70% of its electricity grid, the very lifeblood of its industrial policy. Niger, meanwhile, got a trickle of euros, barely enough to keep the lights on in its own capital, and a desert landscape dotted with radioactive dust, a toxic legacy of extraction. For 5 decades, the same pattern held, an almost theatrical performance of colonial inertia. Niamey, time and again, would ask for renegotiation. Paris, with a paternalistic pat on the head, would promise development aid, which were usually tied to contracts for French companies naturally. Sadly, these exploitative contracts rolled over, year after year, decade after decade. You see, the people who could have stopped it, the African leaders, were often the same people who benefited from the arrangement, or were too beholden to Paris to challenge it effectively. While Électricité de France, EDF, exported 3 billion euros of surplus power every single year, fueled by Nigerian uranium, Niger itself stayed stubbornly, tragically, at the bottom of the UN Human Development Index. However, even the most carefully constructed illusions eventually cracked. By 2013, the cracks were undeniable. French troops were fighting jihadists in Mali under Operation Serval, ostensibly to protect the region. Yet, every air raid, every military operation seemed to recruit more rebels. Locals on the ground, the very people France claimed to be protecting, started accusing Paris of something far more cynical, of protecting the mines, not the people. They weren't fooled. They saw the strategic interests, the resource extraction, the continued presence, and they drew their own conclusions. Then came the seismic shifts. when Mali's army, fed up with the endless conflict and the perceived ineffectiveness of the French presence, booted out the French in 2021 and brought in Russian trainers, the mood spread east like wildfire. This wasn't just a local upset, it was a signal. A clear, unmistakable message that the old ways were no longer acceptable. Burkina Faso followed suit in 2022, with crowds cheering loudly as the French tricolor was lowered, symbolically severing a century of ties. Yet, even then, Paris clung desperately to Niger. Why? Because Niger was the last uranium link, the absolute keystone of the Sahel security belt, and, crucially, France's cheap energy supply. This illusion, this desperate hope that Niger would remain tethered, shattered on the 26th of July, 2023. That's when General Abdourahmane Tiani's soldiers stormed the presidential palace, arrested the Western-friendly Mohamed Bazoum, and within days, parked Russian Wagner trucks outside the parliament. The symbolism was as stark as it was deliberate. Crowds took to the streets, chanting, "Down with Françafrique," and, in an act of profound defiance, burned Macron's effigy in the very same streets where French paratroopers had once trained the presidential guard. The message couldn't have been clearer. The game was up. Now, let's talk about the heart of the matter, the money. Orano's deal in Niger wasn't just lopsided, it was engineered to be perpetual, designed to self-renew, almost like a financial black hole for Niger. A crucial 2015 addendum to the contract gave France automatic extension rights, cementing its control, and capped Niger's share at a measly 5.5% of the spot price. Think about that. Not the final market value of the processed uranium, not the electricity generated, but a tiny fraction of the raw materials price. Independent auditors later looked at this arrangement, this half-century of extraction, and valued the undiscounted haul at a staggering $500 billion over the life of the contract. Think about that, $500 billion. Instead, it flowed directly into French coffers, fueling French industry, keeping French lights on. It's a number that should make your blood boil, because it represents a colossal transfer of wealth from one of the world's poorest nations to one of its richest. On 21st December 2023, Niger's junta, now firmly in control, finally said no. A polite letter perhaps, but a devastating one. They didn't just revoke Orano's operating permit, they froze exports and sealed the border. Imagine this. Overnight, Orano, the French state-owned nuclear giant, had to write off $210 million of inventory. Its share price slid 12%, a direct and immediate hit. And Électricité de France, EDF, the national utility, had to scramble, desperately trying to secure replacement uranium from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, at prices 30% higher than what they were paying Niger. The shock wasn't confined to corporate balance sheets. It rippled through every French utility bill. Nuclear energy, the sacred cow of French industrial policy, the backbone of its economic independence, had just lost its cheapest, closest, and most reliable supply. This wasn't just a business dispute. It was a profound blow to France's national pride and its energy security strategy, a strategy built on the assumption that African resources would always be available on preferential terms. With France's ambassador expelled and 1,200 French special forces ordered home, a vacuum was created, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. Moscow and Beijing, ever opportunistic, ever strategic, wasted no time stepping in. Russian military advisors, fresh from their successes in Mali and Burkina Faso, moved into the old French air base at Wallam. It's almost too perfect a symbol, isn't it? The former colonial power's strategic outpost now occupied by a new, assertive player. Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear energy corporation, sent its exploration team to Niamey. Or at least, a much better deal than the 5.5% Niger had endured for decades. China's CNMC, already a significant player in the region with a gold mine nearby, floated an even more comprehensive package. a billion-dollar offer to refurbish the existing uranium plant, build a solar microgrid to provide sustainable energy, and finance a rail spur to the Benin border, crucially bypassing the old French-controlled routes. The offers from these new players were strikingly simple and, for the junta, incredibly appealing. No political lectures, no colonial baggage, just hard infrastructure paid for in hard currency with better terms. For the junta, the choice was not just easy, it was a no-brainer. Why stick with a master that took 95% of your wealth when you could swap them for one that takes only 49? This isn't just about resources, it's about dignity, about sovereignty. The Sahel states, recognizing their newfound leverage and shared grievances, signed a mutual defense charter in September 2023. Now, diplomats speak openly of an alliance of Sahelian states, stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, an ambitious new bloc anchored by Russian guns and Chinese capital. This isn't just a shift in alliances, it's a potential redrawing of the geopolitical map of Africa, a challenge to the established world order, and a clear indication that the era of uncontested Western influence is, for all intents and purposes, over. Meanwhile, Paris, caught flat-footed, tried every lever in its diplomatic toolkit. Macron invoked the Energy Charter Treaty, a complex international agreement, hoping to legally challenge Niger's move. He threatened World Bank arbitration and even floated sanctions, desperately trying to coerce Niger back into the old arrangement. But Niger's rulers, having done their own math, calculated correctly. Europe, particularly France, needs the uranium far more than they need European markets. It was a strategic gamble, and it paid off. But this is a finite resource, a ticking clock. Every replacement ton bought on the spot market pushes the price higher, and the market knows France is desperate. By June 2025, uranium hit $79 a pound, up 7% year to date, a direct consequence of the supply uncertainty and increased demand. And who pays for this? French utilities are quietly passing that cost to consumers, meaning the average French citizen is now footing the bill for decades of colonial exploitation. Meanwhile, the EU, finally recognizing the fragility of its supply chains, has listed uranium as a strategic mineral in its new Critical Raw Materials Act. It's a good step, but it's late. Brussels has no military footprint in the Sahel, no immediate leverage. And now, in a bitter, almost poetic irony, the very country that is seen as Europe's geopolitical rival is now a crucial link in its energy security. The geopolitical takeaway here is stark, undeniable, and frankly, quite astonishing. A single African state, long dismissed as a backwater, just forced a G7 member to fundamentally rewrite its energy security doctrine. This isn't just a minor blip, it's a profound rebalancing of power, a clear signal that the old rules no longer apply. The world is changing, and the people who ignored the warnings are now watching the consequences unfold in real time. So, what next? Well, Niger is not an isolated coup, not a random anomaly. It is the last, crucial tile in an anti-French mosaic that has been steadily forming across the Sahel. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, together, control a significant uranium belt, a resource-rich corridor that could supply a quarter of global demand by 2030. Think about the power that gives them. If they coordinate export taxes through their new alliance, if they act as a unified front, they can dictate terms the way OPEC once did with oil. This isn't just about resource control, it's about market power, about finally leveraging their natural wealth for their own benefit. For France, the options are unpalatable to say the least. Accept significantly higher fuel costs, which will inevitably be passed on to consumers and impact industrial competitiveness. Or, perhaps most gallingly for Paris, court the very regimes it once dismissed as military dictatorships, humbling itself to secure access to essential resources. For the Sahel, the risks are just as real, and we have to acknowledge that. Russian security guarantees often come with credible allegations of human rights abuses, a troubling trade-off for short-term stability. And Chinese loans, while offering much-needed infrastructure, can turn into debt traps, especially when commodity prices fall, leaving nations beholden to Beijing. This isn't a utopian shift. It's a complex, fraught transition. Yet, for the first time since 1960, the bargaining power, the leverage, sits squarely in African capitals, not on the Quai d'Orsay, the traditional seat of French diplomacy. This is a fundamental, irreversible shift. The era of cheap African uranium feeding European reactors is over. The era of African states auctioning their riches to the highest bidder on their own terms has begun. So, is this the definitive end of Françafrique, or just its latest, most cunning mutation? Will this nascent uranium cartel reshape global energy dynamics, forcing a complete overhaul of how we think about nuclear fuel? Or will Paris, with its long history of backroom dealings, find a backdoor to sneak back in, reasserting its influence through new mechanisms? These are not easy questions, and the answers will define the next decade for both Africa and Europe. Drop your take below. What do you think happens next? This story isn't over, not by a long shot. France is just the first domino, and the next one it might surprise you even more. And if you want more stories on how resources redraw world maps, on how the real strategies and power shifts affect Africa and the world, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next scramble. Because we are going deeper, and the truth is always much more interesting than the headlines.